also. So let's get started. So Stuckey & Company is a insurance MGA. We offer our agents access to solid A-rated carriers like the Hartford, Safeco, Travelers, and Chubb, just to name a few. We have 9 specialty programs. And basically, we will create the program, we underwrite to them, we rate, quote, bind, issue, endorse, renew. We integrate the systems. We have a lot of really cool APIs that we can give to our agents. And sometimes we handle the claims. Most often the carrier does. And we almost always do the marketing and the training. So these are some of our programs. Safety Tech is a technology E&O product. Aspire is a architects and engineers program. Harbor Guard for marinas and boat dealerships. MPL is miscellaneous professional liability. I think we have 350 classes that we can write miscellaneous professional for. Element for the green energy industry. Personal lines, which is home, auto, boat, and high value home. Commercial lines, BOP, comp, commercial auto, bonds, EPLI, D&O, you name it. For small, mid-market, we write some national accounts as well. And then we have a surplus lines product if it falls outside of the commercial. So next, I guess I'd like to thank Brandon Boyd, Assistant Vice President of the Multinational Property Casualty Unit of Westchester, and Michelle Hovis, Professional Liability Underwriter at Stuckey & Company, for making themselves available for questions during and after the webinar on the availability and advantage of the product. So let me turn it over to Brandon and get started.
All right, thank you, Dwight. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you for everyone for joining us on the phone. We appreciate everyone's time. All right, so let's make sure.
There we go.
All right, perfect.
Right on.
Looks like we're on board. Let me expand. All right, we should be good to go. As Joy mentioned, my name is Brandon Boyd. I am the product lead for Westchester's foreign package, which is called International Advantage. That's our brand name. Just to give you a quick bio on myself, I've been with the organization since 2003, back when it was ACE. And I've been specifically focused on our multinational product line since 2005. So it's at 13 years now. And over my years of underwriting the product and now managing this foreign package product, some common feedback that I've received from our trading partners tends to be that placing international coverage can be challenging. It can be difficult. It can be confusing, right? So, some of the questions that pop up: when do clients need it? What value is there in this coverage? How do we help prevent gaps in coverage? And then one of the other common objections or challenges is, quite frankly, we don't see a lot of this business. All right. So with human nature being what it is, people are going to steer away from things that they just aren't comfortable with. So one of my primary objectives over the past year or so has really been educating our partners, right, on the basics of international insurance, really addressing some of those questions and those challenges that I mentioned earlier. And that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to run through just a broad overview of international insurance coverage. If anyone has any questions, feel free to jump in and ask those questions. We're here to help. I'd like to make these interactive. Run through coverage components, gaps in coverages left by domestic, and the best for last is we'll get into claim scenarios. And I think that they're really important because they help emphasize the value of a foreign package policy, and it gives you something to go back to your clients with and say, this is exactly what you're paying for, right? Here are some things that can happen overseas that you may not think about, and here's how this Westchester foreign package policy is going to respond and make you whole. All right. Let's see here. All right. So I always like to start off with statistics or numbers, mainly because I'm an insurance nerd and I love numbers, but it helps quantify the amount of organizations that have some type of international exposure, and that equals opportunities, right? And that kind of combats that one challenge where, some agents may come back and say, listen, we don't see a lot of opportunities here. But if you can look at this cool infographic that we put together last year, it kind of breaks down opportunities, right? So we'll jump into foreign travel. All right. So each year there's about 5 million individuals traveling outside of the United States on business overseas. So 5 million individuals traveling overseas, right? So think foreign trips, right? They're traveling outside the United States. There's an exposure there. All right. And it's not just businesses that have foreign exposures. Think about churches, right? We write a ton of churches. Actually, a pretty significant portion of our portfolio is religious institutions and religious organizations. So each year, there's almost 2 million individuals, Americans, that travel overseas on mission trips, right? So U.S.-based church, group of volunteers together traveling overseas, performing mission work, there's an exposure there. All right, and it's not just businesses and it's not just churches, but think about educational institutions, right? You have a university. They have a study abroad program. Each year there's about 300,000 students studying overseas each year through a study abroad program. And it's not just study abroad programs. Think about, your local high school Spanish class, right, that decides to take a week-long or a 10-day trip over to Madrid, Spain during spring break, right? So you have a student travel exposure, you have faculty travel, you can have chaperone travel. There's definitely an exposure there. And again, that equals opportunities. And it's not just foreign travel, right? That's a majority of what we see in terms of overseas exposures. But think about businesses, and think about businesses that classify themselves as exporters of goods, right? So exporters of products that are traveling outside the United States. There's about 300,000 organizations within the United States that classify themselves as exporters of goods. All right. And if they're exporting products, what happens if a product gets shipped overseas and say that product is defective and it causes bodily injury or property damage to a third party, and there's an overseas occurrence? Who's going to respond, right? Who's going to respond to that, especially if that claim is actually brought overseas in that country where that occurrence took place? And in this graphic too, this pie chart, another thing I wanted to break out, because it's interesting, because there's a misconception that, a business has to be a multinational conglomerate to have some type of overseas exposure. But if you can see here, 98% of these US-based companies that classify themselves as exporters are actually SMEs, which are small to medium-sized enterprises or small to medium-sized exporters. So, this is your small commercial or your middle market business that fall into these categories. That essentially means they have less than 500 employees. All right, so this was my Letterman attempt. So it's the top 10, just in terms of classes of business. We're really where we see the most volume, right, in terms of units. Manufacturers and distributors is number one. That's huge, right? And that kind of ties back to the exporters, manufacturers, distributors, wholesalers of goods. They're shipping products overseas. That's where we tend to see the most volume from, which kind of makes sense. I mentioned educational institutions and religious organizations, but also NFPs or nonprofits fall into that category as well. And they tend to spike up just in terms of overseas exposures when something happens, really when there's some type of global event. So for instance, what happened towards the end of last year in the Caribbean, we're seeing a lot of NFPs pop up and travel down to those areas impacted by the hurricanes because they're providing relief efforts. That kind of makes sense. So obviously there's an exposure there. We also read a lot of professional services. So think about businesses that fall into that 8700 SIC code series. So engineers, architects, surveyors, 8742, so business and management consulting services, a lot of those professional services, law and accounting firms, IT. And then something else that we see a lot of, not necessarily out of the Midwest, mainly on the West Coast, is entertainment business. So if you think about movie productions, concerts, short-term events, commercials, and things like that. If there's any type of travel overseas or shooting that takes place, or think concerts, overseas tours, that's us, right? That's kind of right in our wheelhouse. And by no means is this our exclusive appetite. We have a very, very, very aggressive appetite. We quote over 80% of all submissions that come in the door. I think our decline ratio is about 6 or 7%. So we're very aggressive. There's just a few classes that we really won't entertain. And really that kind of ties back to a really tough products liability exposure. So critical automotive components, aerospace, railroad, we're going to steer away from. Really caustic types of chemical manufacturers we'll steer away from. But even for those types of risks, from a products liability side, we might steer away from it. But if they have individuals traveling overseas on business for business development purposes, we'll still take a swing at that, right? We're just going to steer away from the products completed operations coverage, but we'll look to pick up the foreign comp coverage. All right, so why is international insurance important? All right, so if anyone's ever traveled over to London, the London subway system, you see the signs that say mind the gap. There's actually speakers that say, that warn people to mind the gap, and essentially it's making people aware of the gap between the platform and the train itself. Watch your step. We kind of borrowed that / stole it as one of our slogans. And we use the mind the gap to help educate trading partners on gaps that exist within domestic insurance coverage for foreign exposures, right? And this is where I tell people to read the fine print, or agents to read the fine print for their domestic CGL policy, domestic comp, et cetera, when you do have a client that has a foreign exposure, right? So you can see here, domestic insurance coverage sometimes does not adequately respond to risk organizations face when traveling or operating outside the country. And the last thing you want to do as an agent is have a loss that is not covered. It puts you in an E&O exposure, right? So from a workers' compensation standpoint, something to think about, right? How will the domestic workers' compensation coverage respond if an employee is injured or becomes ill while working outside the United States? Most workers' compensation policies or coverages have something called extraterritorial benefits, which could kick in and extend state of hire benefits to an employee while temporarily traveling overseas, not permanently stationed in most cases. And each state differs in regards to the time limit. So you could have coverage, you could not. But a really important gap in that coverage is emergency assistance services, right? So that could mean emergency medical assistance. It could extend to political assistance, repatriation or evacuation, and also natural disaster. I mentioned the hurricanes a few minutes ago. What happens if you had a client that was in the Caribbean they're performing mission work, and a hurricane is scheduled to hit the island? You want to make sure that insured gets those clients out of there. So having some type of natural disaster evacuation coverage in place can help facilitate that. So that's an important component of a foreign package policy. From a general liability standpoint, how will my domestic CGL carrier or coverage respond to a claim that occurs outside of the foreign or in a foreign country? So again, this is where I ask agents to read fine print. A lot of domestic CGL policies, you can extend coverage to be worldwide. All right, read the fine print, because what that typically means is, yes, we can extend the domestic CGL coverage to be worldwide, and we will respond to foreign-based occurrences, but only if that suit is brought back into the United States. All right, so that's important because that doesn't always happen. Most of the time it does, but as we'll see from some claim scenarios too in market material that we have, you could have a potential loss that occurs overseas, and that claimant decides to bring suit in that particular country. What happens a lot of times is it falls outside of that domestic CGL coverage jurisdiction, right? And you could have a potential gap in coverage that leads to basically an uninsured loss. Auto coverage, that's pretty self-explanatory, and I'll get into a claim scenario when we run through our story later on auto coverage and how we would respond to that. Property, again, is pretty self-explanatory, and then kidnapping and extortion, I'll touch on that as well. All right, so what is International Advantage? What is Westchester's particular product? What are the nuances of it? What is it? What is it intended to do? So foreign package policy, our foreign package policy is designed to protect, very important word, businesses, their employees, independent contractors, yes, independent contractors, volunteers, yes, volunteers, and yes, the students, while traveling, working, or conducting business outside of the country. So it has to be a U.S.-based organization or U.S.-based client that has some type of foreign exposure. All right, ways in which we protect and insure its business. And think of this, it's a package policy, right? People get hung up on, what is foreign coverage? So think of it as just a foreign package policy, similar to a domestic middle market package policy, but it's just foreign. So you have general liability coverage. In most cases, like I said, we can extend products liability coverage. We have contingent auto liability coverage. Contingent is an important word there. It essentially means that we would be difference in conditions, difference in limits over any underlying primary coverage. So what happens in most cases is you have a U.S.-based organization traveling overseas or having employees travel overseas. They could be renting vehicles. And what typically happens is that insured will purchase the local primary auto coverage through the rental agency. And the reason they do that is to satisfy local requirements, right? To meet minimum statutory requirements or satisfy compulsory coverages. And typically, in a lot of countries, those required auto liability limits tend to be very low. So most businesses will just purchase the minimum, say it's $50,000 in U.S. coverage. What happens if one of those employees gets into a pretty serious car accident and causes significant bodily injury or property damage to a third party? More than likely, you're going to exhaust that primary coverage very quickly. And then our auto liability coverage essentially sits on top of that and responds once that primary coverage is exhausted. Our standard limit's $1 million. And then property is also a component of our foreign package. Our foreign package really is casualty driven, but we do offer property coverage. And through the Westchester foreign package, we actually include $25,000 in business personal property, as well as $25,000 in BPP and transit coverage. And theft is a covered peril. And we get asked that question a lot. Think of it as special form property coverage. It's very broad. Ways in which we protect employees, independent contractors, so 1099s, volunteers. So our wording, our definition of employees automatically includes voluntary workers. Like I said, we read a lot of churches, and students. So we have something called employer's responsibility with foreign voluntary compensation. I must run out of breath saying that. So what that is foreign workers' comp. That's just an easy way to put it. So if you have a U.S. national or a U.S. employee traveling overseas, essentially they would be entitled to state of hire benefits. We would look to replicate state of hire benefits if there were to be an injury overseas due to the course and scope of their job, right? So think about occupational injuries as well as endemic disease. Endemic disease is something we pick up too, and that's important because that's a potential gap in coverage too, left by domestic workers' compensation coverage. A good example of that, recently we had, it was a church-based group. They had missionaries traveling to Zimbabwe, and they were out, working with the local community or the local village in Zimbabwe. They were helping to build wells. They were helping to educate children. I think they were building a church as well. And one of the members of the group contracted malaria. All right, so he's out in this remote part of Zimbabwe. The witch doctor couldn't help him, unfortunately. So they actually it was deemed medically necessary to medically evacuate that volunteer to Johannesburg, South Africa, to make sure that he received adequate medical treatment. And I think just the cost alone for the medical evacuation was pretty close to $50,000. That doesn't even include his medical bills. So that's that endemic disease component of our coverage is pretty darn important. And I mentioned that medical evacuation coverage. That's part of the next bullet point, which is executive assistance services. with repatriation. So that includes your medical evacuation, emergency medical coverage. There's concierge services that are included. And then repatriation basically means that if it was a U.S. national, they would bring them back to the United States, which is important as well. Political and natural disaster evacuation is a big component of that as well, and I talked about that earlier. And something else that we have that's really cool is we now have a travel app, a smartphone app that's out there that ties all of these emergency assistance services into a smartphone app. So it works for iPhone, it works for Android, and essentially the client just uses their email address and policy number for their international managed foreign package policy. They plug it in and they can log into the smartphone app. They can enter their itinerary. And also, probably the best feature, and I actually personally use this when I travel overseas, they send real-time push alerts based on the GPS location of your smartphone. And it's kind of cool. So if something's going on, for instance, I was doing a demo of the smartphone app a few months ago, and I just plugged in Brazil as the location of this traveler. And as I'm doing the presentation, I got a real-time push alert regarding, X number of new cases of Zika, the Zika virus being reported. So they'll actually send very useful real-time travel alerts, push alerts to smartphones. That's all included for free within this foreign package policy. There's an accidental death and dismemberment, or A&H component to this foreign package. And think of that as applying to non-occupational injuries or diseases. And that coverage really dovetails nicely with our employer's responsibility coverage, so the foreign workers' compensation coverage. So think foreign workers' comp, occupational injuries or diseases, the A&H component, non-occupational injuries or diseases. And then last but not least is kidnapping and extortion. It is what it is, right? Kidnapping and extortion coverage, and I'll touch on that when we get into claim scenarios. Any questions so far?
There are, but a couple of marketing type questions. One is local foreign coverage needed if international advantage is purchased? So if a U.S.-based business doing business in another country, and it's probably dependent on the country, but is local foreign coverage or local coverage in that foreign territory needed if the international is purchased?
Great question. And how nerdy do I want to get here? So, and you actually made a good point, Dwight. It depends, right? It depends on the country. And it's funny because I tell people, especially domestic underwriters, I'm like, you have to worry about 50 states. We have to worry about 200 countries. And every country is different in regards to compulsory or mandatory insurance coverages. Most times, auto liability is a mandatory coverage. And again, like I said earlier, that coverage is typically available in the local market, especially if you have folks renting vehicles. They're going to purchase it through the local rental agency. The one that we see more often than not is workers' compensation as being compulsory. And a lot of countries out there have a social scheme or a social system, just like they have it in Canada, they have it in Mexico, where essentially the compensation is handled through the government. Workers' compensation is handled through a government. The businesses actually distribute money into a pool, and then injured employees can reach into that pool to help make themselves whole. But in some countries, that's not the case, where you may be required to purchase local workers' compensation or another coverage that's required to satisfy compulsory requirements through the private insurance sector, which is where we would come in. And I'll actually, it's probably a pretty good segue into this slide right here. You see our global reach, right? So owned offices in 54 countries. So that means we have a Chubb/Westchester owned office in 54 countries. And then we actually work with local carriers in another 140 countries. So that's 200 plus countries out there that we can actually write local admitted coverage. So it's on local paper to satisfy any of those needs. And if you do have a risk that has a physical presence in another country, more often than not, they're going to need some type of local coverage. It's important to eventually work with us or work with Dwight, and we can work with him and his team, because we can help provide you that information. We have resources that we utilize that can provide insurance market reports for countries X, Y, and Z, right? We can actually go through and help guide you and say, you know, here are the coverages that are compulsory or mandatory. You know, here are the coverages that we can provide, things like that. In some situations, certain countries might require a local broker, a licensed local broker. And we realize that a lot of times, you know, smaller or even mid-sized U.S. agents don't have a network, you know, a world network of agents. We can actually help facilitate the local placement through a local reputable agent as well. So, you know, you can see here, we have dedicated personnel, experienced underwriting claims teams. That's all we do. That's all that I do. That's all my team does. We just do multinational insurance. I don't dabble in domestic insurance. We have a dedicated multinational claims team. We have local claims folks on the ground overseas as well. We have a global service. I think it was, last count was like 300 plus individuals just dedicated to our multinational coverage. So this is what we do, and we can certainly help guide you. Like I said, another big thing that we do, or I guess one of the best advantages or greatest advantages of what we do and what our coverage is, something we really pride ourselves on too, is speed and service standards. We want to respond within 24 hours. And the majority of what we write, these foreign package policies, they're going to be under $10,000 in annual premium. I think the last time I checked, it was, you know, 90% of what we wrote was under $10,000 in annual premium. We also like those six-figure accounts as well. So if you have any of those, send them our way. And usually with these smaller accounts, it's first in wins too. So we know that once that submission hits our desk, we need to work on it as quickly as possible. Get a quote over to Dwight and his team, and in turn they'll get it over to you guys. And we don't want to waste anyone's time too, right? Time is money. So I actually measure our underwriters on quote turnaround time, and it's actually built into their underwriting objectives. So they're judged on that when it comes time for merit increases and bonuses. So that's something we really focus on. Best-in-class minimum premiums, online premium starts at $1,250. Standard minimum premium, though, is about $2,500 for these accounts. Expertise, I touched on that. Something else great that we offer, too, is multi-year policy terms. And I don't think too many carriers that offer this product do that. We offer up to a 15% savings on a 2-year policy term and 20% savings on a 3-year policy term. Just to put things into perspective, about 13, 14% of everything that we bind is a multi-year policy. It's kind of a win-win for everyone, including the client. Product flexibility, I mentioned there's an online and offline option, and then global reach, I touched on that. And then, yeah, the technology aspect. I mentioned the travel app, which ties those executive assistant services in. And we have something called Worldview as well, which, again, is a huge differentiator. And it's important for a lot of those larger global clients and clients that have risk managers, where if you did have a client and they had a global policy including coverages in overseas countries, this local admitted coverage, they can actually manage that global program through this Worldview app. You can get copies of the local policies, you can view claims, you can pay. There's all this information in this online tool or application out there. And again, I think we're the only carrier out there, at least we were up until last year, that has a tool this powerful. Any other questions?
There was a question, is Cuba and Puerto Rico considered international?
You guys are coming up with some great questions. Puerto Rico first, and it's good because I was going to talk about this later. So Puerto Rico is typically not part of our coverage territory, but we have the ability to extend coverage to Puerto Rico. And it depends on the domestic program. We've seen some instances where a domestic CGL coverage or domestic program will not extend in Puerto Rico, which I think that's kind of strange, considering it's a U.S. territory. But when that's the case, where they won't extend or choose not to extend, we have the ability to extend our coverage there. A great example, and again, I keep going back to the hurricanes, we've been seeing a lot of contracting-based risk, or contractors doing work in Puerto Rico, and the USVI, which kind of is in that same category. We can extend our coverage to include USVI. So we've been seeing a lot of contracting-based risk doing work there, government-based contract, and we've actually written within the past 2 months a handful of very, very large accounts. Most recently, we wrote an electrical contractor. I think it was in early January. They were going down repairing the power lines in the island, and they were the electrical contractor that were part of the floor contract. It was a $450,000 account, so it was a pretty significant win for us. We also wrote a contracting-based risk in Puerto Rico. They were going down and creating access roads on the island, and I think that was a $150,000 account. So yeah, so yes, we can extend to Puerto Rico. Cuba is a good one as well. So technically, Cuba is still a sanctioned country, or it's still sanctioned by the United States. But in certain situations, our coverage can extend to Cuba. It just has to be approved. And we actually have I mentioned, the teams that we have of dedicated personnel. We have a global compliance team. So what happens is we'll ask you, or we'll ask Joy to ask you, some additional questions regarding the risk. And in certain situations, U.S.-based organizations have the authority or can travel into Cuba. Off the top of my head, it can be religious-based, it could be educational-based. There's certain reasons where you're allowed to travel into Cuba. And if you meet the criteria, you qualify for a general license. So again, we'll ask you some questions pertaining to that. The client comes back, they give us, if the answers are favorable, we run it through our global compliance team, they give us the green light, and then the client is good to go to Cuba, and our coverage would extend. But it's important that we go through that process and approval is granted because we do have a sanctions wording or sanctions exclusion built into our common policy conditions. But good question.
One additional one. His neighbor is traveling outside the U.S. quite a bit now for a pet food manufacturing company.
Yep.
I guess two things. One, if a claim would happen, how is that claim reported? I think I've heard you say something about concierge service kind of attached to the claim service. And then is a pet food manufacturing company something that you would take a look at?
Call me taking a sip. All right, so let's do the appetite first. Yes, we can consider pet food manufacturers. It's a difficult class of business. We're going to ask some additional underwriting questions. More than likely, we probably wouldn't quote that one within 24 hours. Loss history is a big, even domestic loss history we would ask for because that's a big indicator of potential claims even overseas. But yes, I guess the short answer is we can consider it. The second part of that question was how to report claims. So the concierge services or those executive assistance services are really for emergencies, right? So what that does is if there is somebody that needs to utilize one of those services, they call that toll-free number that's 365 24/7. They would be connected to our emergency assistance vendor, which is Generali. And they would help facilitate the services that particular client needs. So whether it be medical evacuation, political evacuation, it could be something as simple as, hey, we need an English-speaking lawyer because one of our employees got thrown in jail. Or, hey, one of our employees lost a passport. What do we do? Or, hey, where's the nearest embassy, U.S. embassy? Those services are all included as well. But that's not necessarily to report a claim. So there's a separate claims reporting procedure because we actually do have an internal claims team. When you receive a copy of the policy, there's a sheet in the policy that says how to report a claim. It includes all the information in there. So yeah, the emergency assistance service is separate. But if there is a compensable loss that our emergency assistance vendor assists with, that's all handled behind the scenes. The insured still has to file a claim, but the fees for the emergency assistance services are all handled on the back end. That's handled through us with our vendor.
Right on. Thank you.
Cool.
Yep.
So the last question that we have is there, there's so much opportunity. On your first screen, you had, 2.6 doing this, 1.6 doing that, and all of that. Is there like a list, or how could you target opportunities like that? Do you kind of call on the business and target manufacturers, and because they're the top industry, or churches because they're the top industry? You offer it to all your clients. How do you think the best way to bring opportunities in?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And it's funny because I had a staff meeting this morning, and that was one of the questions I asked to underwriters, right? Because we do have big growth goals for this product this year within Westchester, and it's how can we help you get more of this? And I ran through those numbers earlier, right? And you have almost 7 million, individuals, organizations traveling overseas. You have another 300,000 exporting goods. The crazy thing is that we estimate 20 to 25% of those organizations actually purchase a comprehensive foreign package policy. What most organizations do is they put those Band-Aid coverages in place. So they might purchase a BTA, a business travel accident policy for the travelers, or they might do that worldwide extension under the domestic CGL coverage. But, as I mentioned earlier, that leads to potential gaps in coverages, and we've seen it. So educational aspect is a big part of it. So that's part of the purpose of this call. But from, an agent's perspective, ask the question, right? Ask the question to your client. So if it is a church, do you have any trips overseas? Are you doing any mission work overseas? Look at their website. Us as underwriters, that is the first thing that we do. When we get a risk in, well, before we log it or after we log it, we'll jump into the website because the website tells you so much information about that risk. You go into the Contact Us section. You look in the Contact Us section. Wait a minute. They have a location in London. They have a location in Shanghai. Who's insuring this? Because we're not. That's a flag right there. Or you're looking at a church website and you see pictures of them. Some of the church volunteers building a school or building a church in an African nation, Sierra Leone. Wait a minute, we didn't know about this, right? So I think understanding it and asking the question of the client is important. And that's really where you're going to start to uncover a lot of these opportunities, because you have to think about it from the client's perspective. Most of these organizations aren't insurance savvy, right? We're not working with risk managers here. You might be dealing with a treasurer that's in charge of putting insurance in place. So asking those questions and even educating them. So some of the information that Dwight and his team will pass out, we have these International Insurance 101 sheets, and it's basically foreign package policies for dummies, right? And those yellow books that are out there, it's meant to just break it down, simplify it, demystify it, and really help agents as well as potential clients understand the importance of a foreign package policy, how we fill in those gaps in coverages, what our coverage components are, what they're intended to pay for. That's a great document to use as a resource. And also the claim scenarios. The claim scenarios document is huge because, again, like I said earlier in the call, it says this is, I have my claim scenarios, my story here that we'll run through in a couple minutes. This is what can happen overseas. Here are the types of claims that this carrier is seeing. Here's how the policy responds to it. So, that investment in a $2,500 foreign package policy was a pretty darn good investment when we had to, or else we would have been on the hook for that $50,000 medical evacuation loss. So the claim scenarios are important as well. But yeah, to answer the question is, just, ask the question of the client. Look at their website, do your research, and if you see some of these areas, these indicators, like I said, the Contact Us section, the About Us section, pictures on the website that seem to indicate that there's a foreign exposure, ask that question.
Right on. And just ask questions, right? So I'd like to put it out there. Would we have some things I'll follow up with, like the highlight sheet and the marketing sheet, and it basically has the same information as a PowerPoint, but would a PowerPoint, asking our agents that are on today, would a PowerPoint that steps through each section of coverage be beneficial for you to use with your clients? So let me know if it is. And one last question, Brandon, and thank you so much for answering all these. Is the accident and health coverage the equivalent of a Cigna travel health plan?
Yep, it's pretty similar, and honestly, those BTA policies tend to be a little bit more broad than what we're offering. Ours is kind of like an ancillary coverage, and it's just geared towards international exposures. So programs through Cigna or another carrier, even from the Chubb side, we have a BTA policy, tend to be worldwide. Limits tend to be a little bit broader. But our coverage, our A&H coverage, is really meant to complement or dovetail with our foreign workers' compensation coverage. So the idea behind it is, again, it's a gap filler, right? It's to prevent any types of potential gaps in coverage. So I'm actually going to talk about it in this claim scenario. You know, if you have an individual, a client, one of their employees is traveling overseas, and say they're over there for a few weeks, but on the weekend they decide to go and, do some type of activity that's non-work related, and they get injured. Well, that's where that A&H policy kicks in, right? Because more than likely it's going to be a non-occupational injury. It's not going to tie back to the foreign comp. And you just want to make sure there's no potential gap in coverage, and they would file it under our A&H program or our A&H coverage.
Gotcha.
Right on. Thank you.
Awesome.
So I know you have some claims examples, and I know some people may have to go because we only scheduled it for half an hour, but I guess we still have time, or we can reschedule another webinar that addresses those as well.
Sure. Do you want to do it on a separate webinar, or do you want to roll through it now?
Let's go ahead and roll through it.
Okay.
If you can, and if somebody can't make it, they can view the webinar online, or we can also schedule another one.
Perfect. Yep, I think it's great. And again, these are, I'll tell a story here, and it's kind of meant to give it a high-level overview. And some of it is a little far-fetched, but we'll prep this. But all right, we'll just jump right into it. So, story here. So we have it, and it's a story, right? It's not true. So we have an individual called Unlucky Andy, right? And he's an executive for a widget manufacturer that's based in the U.S., and he's looking to strike a deal with a company that's based in Singapore. All right. And this organization is going to be able to manufacture several components of Andy's company's product at a lower cost. So it's a big deal for Andy to make this deal, right? To finalize this deal. So he travels overseas to Singapore. All right. And like 20% of all international business travelers, Andy decides to rent a vehicle for his trip. Now in Singapore, cars and other vehicles, they drive on the left side of the road, and Andy was not aware of this. So Andy gets his rental vehicle. He's driving down the wrong side of the road. He has to swerve away from oncoming traffic, and he winds up catching the side of his vehicle, as you can see there in the picture, and he causes several thousands of dollars worth of damage to the rental vehicle. All right, that's an issue, right? So luckily, Andy's employer is an insured of Westchester, and they purchased an International Advantage foreign package policy. And through our foreign package policy, we do automatically extend coverage under the auto liability section for hired auto physical damage coverage. There's actually no deductible, so we would pay first dollar. So luckily, this is a covered loss under the Advantage policy. All right. So relief for Andy, right? So Andy no longer has a car, and he's a bit nervous now to drive because of what happened in Singapore. So he actually calls for a personal car to transport him around, right? So a black town car pulls up to the hotel. Andy jumps in without asking any questions, which is bad, right? To Andy's dismay, it was not the car he had ordered. All right. So, in fact, it was two masked gentlemen that decided to hold Andy for ransom. And they drove him around to multiple ATM machines. So I don't know, has anyone ever heard of express kidnappings? All right, they're very common in Mexico. So this is what they do, is they will kidnap a victim. They will drive you around, make you max out your ATM card, and then they will release you. And that's what happened to Andy. So They let Andy go once his ATM card had been maxed out, but Andy was now an express kidnapping victim. So again, it's a good thing that Andy's employer is an international advantage policy holder, and they have kidnapping and extortion coverage because the policy can offer full reimbursement for ransom monies that are paid as a result of kidnapping or extortion. All right. So Andy finally makes it to the meeting. Everything goes great. He's confident that he's going to close the deal. He goes back to the bar. He decides to celebrate with a drink before he goes upstairs to his hotel room. So he sits at the bar, orders an old-fashioned, chats it up with the bartender, and after he finishes his drink, he reaches down to grab his briefcase, which he actually set next to him, next to his chair, and he reaches down and the briefcase is gone. The briefcase contains his laptop, his company laptop, some salesperson samples. He looks all around, it's nowhere to be found. All right, somebody had stolen it, right? So again, as I mentioned earlier, property coverage is a standard part of our offering. Typically $25,000 in business personal property is extended. And also, as I mentioned earlier, theft is a covered peril. It's a covered cause of loss. So again, luckily, Andy's employer purchased an international advantage policy to help pay for this loss. All right. Now, after the ordeal, Andy heads upstairs to the hotel room. He wants to get ready for dinner, and he's actually going to have dinner with an old colleague that now lives in Singapore. As he's getting ready, Andy starts to fill a bath. He wants to take a bath, relax a little bit. The bathtub's filling up. He puts the drain, the water's filling up, and he lays down on the bed, and he says, I'm going to close my eyes for a few seconds while the bathtub is filling up. Well, Andy falls asleep. Then he wakes up, there's a knocking at the door, there's yelling, and he's like, oh my God. He looks over, the hotel bathtub is flooding. Water seeping all down below, reaches the lobby level. It causes tens of thousands of dollars worth of damage. It's a general liability property damage claim, right? So again, something like this could be covered under an international advantage foreign package policy. And again, I know a lot of these are far-fetched, but it's still giving you an idea, right, of things that can happen, things that you don't think about, things that underwriters don't think about in terms of losses. And I know that I said these are hypothetical, but they're based on real-life claim scenarios. All right, so it was a stressful week for Andy, and he decides to go for a hike after everything that had happened. And it's a day before he's scheduled to leave. He's scheduled to fly back to America, and he goes for a hike. All right, and as he's going for a hike, he has a misstep, and he slips and falls down a hill, and he hears a crack. It's his arm. All right, something's wrong. So he goes to a hospital, the local hospital, and he gets admitted to the hospital, and it turns out that he has a fractured arm. All right, we kind of talked about this earlier. It wasn't during the course and scope of his job, right? So something like this would fall under our A&H coverage. And again, that's something that's provided through the International Advantage Foreign Package policy. So Andy gets some adequate medical treatment that he needs in the hospital. And again, it's a claim that can be paid by the International Advantage Foreign Package policy. And even though he's called Unlucky Andy as he's sitting in the bed, the hospital bed, he gets a phone call, and it turns out that the deal was made. All right, so even though all these bad things happen to Andy, it winds up being a happy ending because the deal is struck. All right, so those are all the claim scenarios, and like Dwight said, we actually have a pretty cool claim scenario sheet that I can send out, or he can send out afterwards, which covers different claim scenarios, and again, it's really important. It helps emphasize the foreign package policy and the coverages and all those great details.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was terrific. I will get to work and put together, thank you. Put together the marketing sheet, the highlights, the claim scenarios, the app, and there's quite a few people that said that a PowerPoint would be nice to have to step their prospective clients through.
We have it.
So I'll actually create that. I'll send it to you for approval, and then I'll get it out to our agents.
Excellent.
And you need to make an iMovie out of Unlucky Andy.
I usually do it in person. I'm waving my arms and things like that. I make it a very, visual.
Yes. Yes, I think you could win an Oscar.
I'll start working on the script now.
Yes, thank you.
Exactly.
Welcome. And yeah, if there's any questions after the fact, just let me know, and I can respond back.
Sounds good.
Good.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Michelle. And thanks, everybody, for attending.
Yes, thank you, all attendees. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all.